Only 4 of the 65 Fortnite players in this lobby positioned themselves above this line. This dead side of the zone is often hailed as the best position for pro players to put themselves in, so why aren't any of them there? Well, because it's not the best position in the zone for every team, and a lot of people suck at rotating. And this is actually where game winners iDrop and Mappy position themselves at this point in the game. They clearly know what they're talking about since they won 3 of the 6 games and the overall tournament. But in order to figure out why this position's actually so good, we actually have to go back 1 zone to the 4th zone where they position themselves on this hill, roughly 1/3 of the way into the safe circle. So what's good about this spot? Well, it's a power position on the map with massive sightlines onto players rotating in the open ice to their east. It's also a cliff edge that peers down into the jungle biome, giving them great sightlines here. It has a ton of fast harvesting brick that they can refarm to ensure they have as many materials as possible after building their surge bases. It has sightlines to the rift island that spawns nearby, allowing massive damage to be dealt to players attempting to capture the island. And it even has slurp plants nearby to regenerate shield they lose when they're trading damage with nearby players. Yet, none of these reasons are why this position is actually good. The real reason is zone priority. This is a theory the ex-Fortnite coach and now FNCS broadcast producer Mikkel told me about that I've now expanded on. Let's take a closer look at that position from iDrop and Mappy. At the time they claimed it, it was relatively close to the center of the 3rd zone, and there were a large number of players to the south of them. The 4th zone in this game also pulls to the north, so this leaves them relatively close to the edge of that next zone, which means when these large cluster players to the south would eventually rotate up north of them, they may potentially fight them. But this also means that they can farm these players for storm surge damage from a safe distance. The congestion side is what we would call a low priority position. All of these players have to wait for another player in front of them to rotate before they can actually start moving themselves. So this area here would be all of the low priority area. The high priority area would be the dead side and the center of the zone, as these places often have the least players or the quickest rotates, and the remainder is the medium priority area. And as you see, the position that iDrop and Mappy put themselves in was a medium priority position, and this is so that they could take advantage of all of the players in the low priority areas and rack up the storm surge damage on them. The reason they left this position so quickly was because the next zone had already pulled, and since they had their storm surge damage already, they prioritized getting themselves to a high priority area, as this would give them the freest rotates. And this is where you can form a fairly simple game plan. High priority areas give you the freest rotates if you don't need storm surge damage, as there's not going to be that many players around you to tag. Medium priority areas give you a reasonably free rotate, however there's enough players around you to rack up storm surge damage, and low priority areas suck. Now where things get interesting is the next zone. We're going to compare 2 teams, Mappy and iDrop, who won the game, against Blurfire and Skrill, who, yeah, they didn't. The 5th zone pulls yet again to the north. iDrop and Mappy use this rift statue to try and fly as deep into the zone as possible to get to a high priority area. Unfortunately, they're shot out of the sky and lose a bunch of HP and are forced to land in a medium priority area. Since all of these zones have pulled to the north, all of those players to the south are now fully stuck along the south edge of this zone, creating an insanely congested area. The 6th zone now pulls to the east, and they're able to use their slap splashes to give themselves infinite run energy and sprint the entire rotation without being shot once. But how? With so many other teams in the area struggling to rotate since they're repeatedly being tagged and held by other teams, how is it that iDrop and Mappy can just run this so freely without being shot once? Especially from this unremarkable position that's nowhere near as good as the one they were in the previous zone. Or so you might think. Take a look at this map when the 6th zone pops. You can see a ton of players are all stacked along the edge of the zone. Now, since there's no held mobility items like kinetic blades, in order for this team to rotate to the next zone, the team in front of them has to move first, and the team in front of them also has to move before them, and so on and so forth. As we know from the previous zone, this is a low priority position. They have to wait for other players ahead of them to go before them, and this is true almost irrespective of wherever this zone would pull in this particular situation. Norixie and Cisse are taking advantage of this by tagging every single team that's along this congested side as they try to rotate, and their focus is facing south. But if you look at the map, they're one of the only teams who would actually look at iDrop and Mappy as they rotated, and they're focusing south, giving iDrop and Mappy that free rotate. And the reason there's not that many other teams focusing them is because they're in a medium priority area. Hopefully you're starting to see why medium and high priority areas are so good for rotations. Because they were consistently in high or medium priority areas, the only damage that iDrop and Mappy took were while they were rifting through the sky. So let's compare that to Blurfire and Skrill, who were constantly in a low priority area throughout the entire game. If we go back a couple of zones, we can see that they rotated very late into the 4th zone and get held by Mr. Savage and Vadil in front of them. Because they have to rotate into them, they end up boxing directly with them and get into an engagement, which wastes more time. Make a good play to get ahead, but now they have teams holding them from the front and Mr. Savage and Vadil behind them. So on this 5th zone rotate, they are in a low priority position as there's tons of teams in front of them who can hold them from here. Out of the 7 teams along the edge of the zone here, it shouldn't surprise you that none of them made it into a single digit placement in this game. To counteract this bad position, they go to Loot Island to gather extra heals, but when they pad to rotate, they're held by even more teams in the low priority area. With a lucky 6 zone pool, they tried to make a good rotate, but are 400 below the Storm Surge threshold and die fighting a team on the edge. And this is actually another massive issue with the low priority areas. Because you're constantly being pressured and focused by teams in the medium priority area and also around you in the low priority areas, there's not as much chance for you to be able to actually deal damage back to other players because you're the one who's getting shot at. Shouldn't surprise you that the team that spent all of their game in high and medium priority areas is almost 900 above the Storm Surge damage threshold, whereas Blurfire and Skrill were 400 below. But of course, the main question I asked in this video was, why are none of the players in the dead side of the zone? What we now know is a high priority area. Well, the 2 teams who are here are Seti and Kami and Paco and Yapko, and they're here because they are above the Storm Surge threshold, so they could move into this area without having to worry about getting more tags. Everyone else in the lobby either needed more Storm Surge damage, so didn't position themselves further into the zone, or their rotates sucked. These zones were relatively simple. They all just pulled up to the north, so it's easy to figure out the majority of players are going to be on the south, rotating from far POIs, and fairly simple to understand where the high and medium priority areas are. But what about a more complicated game? In this game, the first zone pulls to the southeast, and then the second zone does exactly the same thing. So if you understand how to read zones, you would probably predict that the third zone would also pull down to the southeast. However, it does the complete opposite and pulls back to northwest. The result of this is out of the 76 players, 22 of them are below this line and the other 54 are above it. So this does create a dead side versus congested side. Interestingly, the 4th zone doesn't move that much as it's relatively central. Now this allows more players to evenly spread themselves out, but there is still less players in this bottom half. And then the 5th zone yet again pulls central. The result of this is that the majority of players are all around the edge of the previous zone in what we know is a low priority area. Now remember, because this zone is more central and it has had a couple pullbacks, there's not necessarily a fully established dead side in this particular 5th zone. So that would mean that the priority areas look a lot more like this. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of players surrounding the entire outside of the zone in the low priority areas. So let's take a deep dive into how one of the teams got there, which is Nipsey and Archie. I know what you're thinking. I also didn't think this video would turn into an Archie VOD review, but here we are. Now they already start at a disadvantage, and no, not because it's Archie. They're landing in Breakwater Bay, and as you already know, the first 2 zones pull to the southeast, being max distance for them based on their drop spot. This means that in order for them to get to a high priority area, they would have to leave this drop spot incredibly early, sacrificing some of the loot and materials that they could potentially get here. They end up leaving here relatively late and end up on the low priority zone in the first zone, and then yet again the same thing on the second zone. At the time that the third zone appears, this is when their combat cache spawns and ends up going to the northeast of them. They rotate over here, but ultimately can't get their cache and end up high on top of a tower, tagging other people for surge. Because they stay here for too long at the edge of the zone, they make a massive mistake. They actually let Giras and Chari get in front of them, allowing them to look back and farm Archie and Nipsey for surge. The ideal situation here is that Nipsey and Archie get ahead of Giras and Chari, and if they continue to rotate early, they can keep farming the same team on every single rotate because they constantly have zone priority ahead of them. However, because they let them get ahead, they became victim to this exact strategy. Now, they do manage to pull a lucky fourth zone that's right on top of them, but they still just get farmed by all these teams in front. And you can probably guess what happens onto the fifth zone as well. Because they're in a low priority position, they then get stuck in another low priority position in that zone. So as you can see, it's very difficult to break the loop. If you get into a low priority position early, it's very difficult to get into a medium or high priority position because low priority teams will wait for medium priority teams to move, medium priority teams will wait for high priority teams to move. There will always be a queuing system like this, and if you fall behind, it's very hard to catch up. However, if you're early enough and you get into a higher medium priority position in the second or third zone, you can constantly stay ahead in these positions. So hopefully that shows you how important it is to ensure that you get into a high or medium priority position early in the game. But so far we've only covered zones 1 through to 5, and there's still 7 more which have completely different different zone priority mechanics. Since zones 6, 7, and 8 are all partial zones, that handy Deadside map that we had earlier will start to look very familiar. Now in this 6th zone rotation, you have the lucky teams who've managed to pull the zone, but the first teams to rotate in are unsurprisingly the teams who are in high priority positions, such as Akira and Skyjump, who you will probably remember from one of my previous videos, Tuna and Dandier, and then Pings and Kyrie. And you'll see that as the medium and lower priority teams end up rotating into the zone, it's a very similar story to the first example that we talked about. A lot of congestion around the edge in the low priority areas, some congestion in the medium priority areas with the teams who have rotated a little bit deeper into the zone, and then the high priority areas are the full Deadside and then the center of the zone. And this exact same cycle repeats for the next two partial zones. The thing that differentiates zones 6, 7, and 8 from the earlier zones is that the high priority zones here are infinitely more important because the players are now so clustered together that it's almost impossible to rotate, and if you are successful, you'll probably waste a ton of heals and materials here. So getting onto the Deadside and in the high priority zones, in the 6th, 7th, and 8th zones, is one of the most beneficial things you can do for your rotations. I mean, look at the 6th zone in this game. The only team here is Cammy and Seti, and when the zone pulls to the southeast, obviously Cammy and Seti pull the zone, but if you look at a team who's had a completely max distance pool, which is Chari and Giras, they have a free rotation throughout this complete Deadside because there is no one stopping them. Contrast that to Akira and Skyjump, who ended up positioning here in the low priority zone, and assume that the 7th zone pulled max distance for them to the west. Before they could even rotate, almost the entire lobby would have to move first. So if you put yourself in a low priority area in the 6th, 7th, or 8th zones, the partial zones, you're just hoping that you're going to pull a good zone. However, if you put yourself in a high priority area, you have significantly more rotation options depending on wherever the zone pulls. And that's where the next strategy, lobby manipulation, comes into play. Let's take a closer look at Cammy and Seti's rotation this game. In the 5th zone, they were in a medium priority area, but obviously lucked out pulling the 6th zone. Since they're smart, they took advantage of this good RNG and used this as an opportunity to get themselves to the dead side of the zone and into a high priority position where they rotated down to the south. Now, because these are partial zones, that means that this area here and this area here are what I'd call temporary zones. And a lot of players use this to their advantage by getting onto the dead side through this area that they know no players are going to be in. But as always, there's going to be a counter to every single strategy. And unsurprisingly, that's going to be zone priority. If you're one of the first people to rotate, like Cammy and Seti, they position themselves ahead of where these players would rotate into. This allows them to hold any players trying to rotate through this area, and you will block them from being able to get to the dead side and the high priority areas and force them into a low priority position. So now they're the only team on this side of the zone, meaning wherever the zone pulls, they have the most options for wherever they want to rotate. But zone priority isn't everything. In the first game that we looked at, Cammy and Seti were in a high priority zone and very quickly died afterwards. In this match that we saw Archie and Nipsey repeatedly be in the low priority zones, it was actually their best game. You can still mess up a good position, or you can fight your way out of a bad position, or it's Fortnite, so RNG also will play a factor, but building a strategy that revolves around being in medium or high priority areas will undoubtedly get you to endgame the most consistently. And if you've not understood a single thing about this entire video and you want an easiest takeaway that you can apply to every single tournament, just stay away from the very edge of the zone and try to rotate a little bit deeper into the safe circle than you probably are already.